Segment 5, how come? From Left Turn, quote, in a typical presidential election, only 7% of Washington correspondents vote for the Republican, close quote. Why? What is the deep structure, deep sociological structure that accounts for this phenomenon that journalists are overwhelmingly liberal?
You know, I don't know, and I don't really address in the book, but here's what I think. I think there's something in the DNA of liberals that makes them go into fields like journalism, academia, the arts. There's something about creative fields where there's kind of no objective standards. You know, the opposite would be, you know, an engineer or a small businessman who has the market. You know, it's an objective standard. Am I making a profit? And these other fields, also where you have to be a little extra creative. There's something about liberals really seek those fields.
All right. Now, what about considering the problem over? And I know that I'm dragging you away from the book, but I just want to know what you think about this stuff. Over time, before Franklin Roosevelt, editorial pages at least, first of all, the notion of liberal versus conservative, as you point out, lots of newspapers in New York City, when Tom Wolfe started his career in journalism in New York City as recently as the late 50s and early 60s, there were, as I recall, 8 functioning newspapers in New York City. And they had distinct, or Britain today, the Guardian is on the left, the Telegraph is on the right, the Times is sort of, okay. But before FDR, editorial pages tended to be to the right, news pages, what changed? In other words, you get in the 60s, you seem to get more, the profession becomes dominated by liberals beginning about the 60s. How come?
I'm not sure. There's a lot of speculation. There's a book by James Hamilton. The printing press did it. Some people say, oh, it was TV, the 3 networks, and all of a sudden when there's a notion of this objective journalism where everyone at least pretends to be objective, still liberals are the ones that flock to that area, and then after a while.
And what are you doing in academia?
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Do you talk about this? Here's a few statistics I found. Center for Responsive Politics. 92% of employees at the University of Chicago who made political contributions in the last round made them to Democrats. At William and Mary, it was 99-1. In the UC system, University of California, it was 9-1. So what are you doing there?
Good question. My wife sometimes asks me about this. I'll come home complaining. Why do you stay in academia? I have got a gene that makes me love research, and I recognize this somewhere in junior high. So I've got the conservative gene, but also the gene to love research. And so
is it just that you're peculiar, or are you the leading edge of a generational change?
I think I'm peculiar.
You're dashing all my hopes here.
Hopefully not.
Okay.
But,
now, let me tell you something. This book is getting attacked by all the people you'd expect to attack it, all the people who don't want to hear the news that it delivers, right? Mm-hmm. But the notion that the media, the mainstream media, is biased to the left, to me that's no surprise, of course. That's just, okay. What you do is pin it down beautifully. Here's the real outrage in this book. And it is an outrage. A moment ago in an earlier segment, I quoted you saying that you didn't used to believe that voters can be systematically fooled. That's the phrase you use, systematically fooled. Mm-hmm. And now you believe they do. Yeah. And that is a direct attack on the notion of democracy itself. Abraham Lincoln was wrong. You can fool all the people all the time. And the founders were mistaken. Americans are unfit for self-government. That's the fundamental finding of Left Turn.
Good point. I would say that they can only be fooled partially. I have a media lambda 0.7. They can only be fooled 70% of the way that journalists want to fool them.
So the proper way to look at this is not to say, oh my goodness, people are voting Democratic 8 points more than they would otherwise. The proper way to say, well, that may be so, but if you could fool all the people all the time, we'd have been communist by about 1967. Is that
Good point. I think so. Yeah, I think that's right.
I'm trying to find if this has troubled you at all. That you just take democratic theory and give it a swift kick.
Yeah. Not only that. One thing I should say though, the other thing is that if somehow you could make people aware of this, that we don't discount the bias as well as we should. We don't think about it, I think, as rationally as we should. If all of a sudden we could, if places like the Media Research Center and the counterpart Media Matters, if both of them are kind of battling against each other, and they can convince voters to be perfectly rational in discounting this bias, that would do the same thing that I talk about in the book about as if we could eliminate media bias. That media lambda that I say is 0.7, that would go to 0 if we were perfectly rational. And if I'm right, all the statistics, calculations in my book, that also would make America move from thinking and voting about like an Iowa voter to thinking and voting about like a Texas or Kentucky voter.
Tim Groseclose. Left Turn, How the Liberal Media Bias Distorts the American Mind is available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. And your website is?
TimGroseclose.com.
Let's spell it.
Yeah,
Tim is obvious. GROSECLOSE.com.
That's right.
Tim, thank you
Peter,
very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.